a disclaimer, there might be some sensitive images in my presentation, just so you're aware and prepared. So my objectives, I want to do a comparison of opiate abuse after the Civil War and our epidemic today, looking at changes in abuse trends and also looking at some viable solutions. So I have my thesis up on the screen, but in summary, I'm going to basically argue that we should learn from the successes and mistakes of America's first war on drugs, and ultimately using harsh tactics towards drug addicts, especially regarding law enforcement and our drug laws, have been largely ineffective, and that we should take a different approach to combating addiction. Just some background information, opiates, that's predominantly what was being used after the Civil War, and that was derived from the opium poppy, versus today we use a lot more opioids, where that's the synthetic form trying to mimic that natural form, and these are much stronger and much more predictable. So just some common prescription opioids: oxycodone, hydrocodone, morphine, I'm sure you're familiar with. And then on the screen here is the amount needed for a deadly dose of some common street opioids. So heroin, this is 30 milligrams amount needed for deadly dose for the average male, versus fentanyl only needs 3 milligrams to be a deadly dose. And then to carfentanil, which was originally created to be a sedative for large animals like an elephant, that in a human it would only be 0.3 milligrams necessary for a deadly dose. And so what's dangerous is a lot of the street drugs are now being, like heroin, for example, is being cut with these harsher drugs, and that's why we're seeing such a big uptick in overdose. So going back to the Civil War, why did we see a lot of opiate abuse? And that was because weaponry technology was extremely highly evolved. The Industrial Revolution had just happened. Meanwhile, there was no medical evolution. It was still the medical medieval ages. So there was no understanding of bacteriology. There was a lot of death from disease. So I'm going to show some pictures from the Civil War. So this is some Civil War weaponry, surgical tools and procedures. So a pile of amputated limbs from surgery. This is a Civil War field hospital. And then finally, a group of Civil War Union veterans and all of the leg amputations. So this was a very gruesome war, and this created sort of a need for recovery with these stronger drugs. So long before this time period, doctors dispensed opiates for practically any discomfort, headaches, intestinal issues, menstrual discomfort, pretty much anything. And addiction was not thought of as it wasn't even considered as a mental disorder until the 1890s. So that was about 30 years after the Civil War. So it was thought as kind of like the result of weak moral values, and opioid abuse, since it wasn't really stigmatized, people didn't really know about it, wasn't necessarily frowned upon. So over time, addiction increased, and these abusers did become outcasted. This led to doctors saying that we should ban some of these drugs and that we should remove them from pharmacies, and also reduce how they're prescribed. And then eventually in the 1910s, opioids became criminalized and regulated. So this forced users to turn to the black market. So how did we see drug abuse trends change? So according to the Bureau of Narcotics, after they they implemented these new drug laws, they published this data which shows the number of addicts versus time. So they said after 1910s that drug abuse decreased with their laws, versus experts now looking in hindsight, since people turned to the black market, on the top graph, they say that drug abuse actually did not decrease with these new laws. Until 1944, where we had World War II, and there was the trade routes to get opium into the U.S. was forcibly cut off. So that forced a reduced consumption, but this is the only time that we've seen forcibly reducing consumption work. And since then, we've tried to replicate that with our war on drugs, trying to cut off these sorts of trade routes, but it's been largely ineffective. So just some statistics, like what is opioid abuse look like today? We have 2 million Americans who are addicted to or abuse opioids. We consume 80% of the world's opioid supply. We have quadrupled rates of opioid overdose and deaths since 1999. And while medical professionals are prescribing less opioids, heroin use and overdose has been increasing. So restrictions on opioid prescriptions, has forced some patients to resort to unregulated, often unsafe street drugs. So here's a graph of that, where we're looking at time versus overdose and death. The top graph is showing due to opioid prescriptions, and the bottom graph shows due to heroin. So after the crackdown in 2010 on opioid and how doctors prescribe opioids, we saw death and overdose from opioids prescriptions maintain a similar trajectory, while with heroin we saw a huge uptick. So, and we also know that 2/3 of heroin users actually begin opioid abuse with prescription drugs. So what are some current solutions? How are we currently tackling this problem? And a lot of what's being thrown out right now is sort of maintaining the status quo. It oftentimes is mimicking what has been done in Civil War, what has been done worldwide that has been ineffective. So just on how large scale the epidemic it is, it's just going to not be effective enough. So back in October, Donald Trump gave a speech on how we're going to combat this epidemic, and he talked about having like sort of a law and order approach, and wants to do another DARE campaign. And unfortunately, both of these sorts of tactics have been largely ineffective. He also wants to do sort of mimicking what they're doing in the Philippines, where they're killing people who are involved with drug abuse. So he wants to do like capital punishment here, and unfortunately, in the Philippines, with all that death, there hasn't been a reduction in drug abuse. So it would be largely ineffective doing that here too. He also was thinking maybe we could reach a drug-free society, and unfortunately, opioids are highly addictive. And also, humans have always thought out intoxicating substances in our culture throughout all of history. So this is just not an accurate thing that we should try to achieve. But what do the experts say? How should we combat this epidemic? And they have 3 fronts that they think would be the best way to combat the epidemic. So first of all, they want to we should just try to reduce the amount of people dying, just reduce the amount of overdose. And then secondly, how can we help abusers to reach sobriety? And then third, how can we prevent new addicts? So first, how can we just reduce the amount of death? And first and foremost, we should increase access to rescue drugs like naloxone, Narcan, and this is the Attorney General, I believe, he just came out and said that we should also do this too. So, and then there's also places called safe injection sites. This is being done in Seattle, where there's healthcare professionals on site to supervise people using these drugs. And there's a lot of concerns associated with this. People think it might increase drug abuse. And it's actually the contrary, where 57% of people who have actually gone to these places actually have entered treatment. So this is a safe injection site in Seattle. It provides a safe space, safe materials, and encourages treatment. This is not the first place where this is being done. This has been done in Canada and Europe since the early 2000s and have been very much effective. So secondly, how can we help abusers to reach sobriety? And honestly, since opioids are so highly addictive, reaching full sobriety is often not a reality. There are programs called methadone programs where addicts are given the weaker form of the drug, but these are highly stigmatized since we aren't achieving that full sobriety that we're all hoping we can reach. We can also revise drug laws and reduce criminalization. This will help abusers to sort of get treatment by increasing their self-efficacy and believe that they won't be punished if they go reach out for help. And then finally, how can we prevent new addicts? We can reduce the initial exposure by, instead of doctors prescribing pain medication, like through opioids, they can recommend like visiting a chiropractor, going to physical therapy, doing exercise, yoga. There's also a lot of new research coming out with virtual reality, hypnosis, and meditation. So on the screen, here's a girl with sickle cell anemia at UCSF, and she's watching virtual reality games so she can distract herself from her pain. There's also alternative pain medications like corticosteroids, SSRIs. Lots of new things with cannabis like CBD and other herbal remedies that are coming out. So finally connecting history to today, the only way that we saw opioid abuse that really slowed was after World War II with the trade routes being cut off. And so we've seen historically also with our current war on drugs, we haven't been able to really fully get a grasp or control of the black market. But we can reduce its size and we can reduce our dependency on it. And if we changed our drug laws, we can help abusers to get treatment and also to use these drugs in safer manners. So ultimately, we really need to change how we're approaching this epidemic. We have far too many people at risk. There's a high social and economic cost of this epidemic, and we can reference our history, statistics, data, new research for how effective our solutions can be. And that concludes my presentation.
So I saw on one of your slides you had two drugs listed, naloxone and Narcan, I think how they're pronounced. What are they used for? Is it like kind of like a substitute of opioids to try and like reduce?
That would be like a methadone program,
okay.
But Narcan or like naloxone, that drug is administered if someone is overdosing to reverse the overdose. Yeah. Do you have a question?
So, with like going back to like history, the Civil War when they first started using it quite a bit, you said there really wasn't a stigma around it. Was it more so just with the men, and then like I don't know, like I'm sure the men were able to use it much more frequently than the women were, but like was it still equal in terms of like there wasn't a stigma, or was it okay for men and okay for women?
There wasn't really a stigma associated with the gender because even like I didn't mention this, but like there's a lot of opioid abuse associated with like veterans, but also with the widowed wives who like lost their husbands.
That's what I was thinking. It's like the men were off fighting, so obviously they had this use, but like with the women, it's like what about them, or they have still okay using it?
Yeah.
This is a comment, but my cousin actually runs a methadone clinic
Okay.
in Washington State, and she's found that it's actually pretty successful with helping people.
Right.
There's a big opioid problem over there as well.
Yeah. Yeah, totally.
So looking like back in history, are there specific methods that worked like post-Civil War treatment that we could kind of apply today, or was?
I think like mostly looking at how like we failed historically, like trying to control the black market by like law enforcement, drug laws, like how that has failed. Like we shouldn't continue to try to do that today. We've seen there's been other epidemics worldwide regarding opioids where they've been able to reduce it with by means of decriminalization, deregulation.
Any more questions?
I asked this question last session, and so I'm going to ask it again, because typically when this conference organizes these sessions, and this isn't particularly to you, Casey, it's to all the presenters, they find a common theme that the presentations are organized around. And I know history is the general one, but I think it goes deeper than that. And so I'm kind of asking you, Casey, Kyle, Eric, Watts, when you were watching the presentations, did you see connections with your research to some of the other presenters?
Yeah.
Start,
it was supposed to be like a history research project, and I thought that too, that I wasn't like really on the same page, but yeah, I don't know. A little history.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Anyone else?
For me, I kind of started because I wanted to figure out more about where drag came from. And I kind of saw the connection of just adding more to the history books, adding more information. Just because a lot of history is like, it's from the majority and not so much of the minorities.
And anyone else see connections among your research?
Not necessarily. Nothing super explicit.
I think like one thing that I saw is we're kind of all looking at sort of stuff that may not be looked at as much in history. Like I don't think too many people look at like historical opportunities. Same with like history drag or something. Too many people look at that. Same with yours. Like not too many people are looking at that period of time. So that's something I saw in the research.
I just walked in here, but to be off of what we're talking about right now, though. So it's like what Eric said. The history is usually the majority minority. So what's happening now, though, is what I'm learning in my history classes is there's beginning to be more representation and more attention to these hidden kind of events and ideals and things that have been throughout time but just haven't been paid attention to. So I think it's very good, like how moving forward, we could understand the past